In 1898, people in the Missouri Ozarks whispered about the terrible story of the Vancroft sisters, who had become their father's lovers. A house in the country, with closed windows. A man of good standing who bought quicklime and sedatives. 2 daughters' names were crossed out of the church record book. Then, a letter that had been hidden for years came to light with only a few lines of ink. This is how a family's secret finally got past the stone wall of silence. But what if the law came too late, and the man was already dead? Could the truth itself be the killer? The record starts not with a shout, but with the soft sound of a pen on paper. In an old church ledger from 1898, the names Ellis and Margaret Vancroft are crossed out with a thick black line of ink. A clerk's careful hand has added a short, damning note in the margin. It doesn't say what they did. It just says what they were. The note says, "Behavior not fit for daughters." That was the only official word for years. The Vancroft sisters were no longer involved in community activities, but in a town where everyone knew everyone else. A silence that loud always finds a voice. It found one in Martha Hensley, the Sunday school teacher who never gave up. She thought about the girls. She remembered how pale their faces were and how they would stand too close together, as if to protect each other from a wind that wasn't there. Their father, Joseph Vancroft, a respected landowner with a grip like iron and a smile that never quite reached his eyes on Sundays, always made excuses for their absences from class. Martha saw that the girls were never with friends their own age. They were always with him, whether they were at the general store, in the wagon, or on the farm. People started to whisper, the kind of talk that goes over fence posts and at sewing circles. At first, people thought it was just gossip. People said that the sisters were too close to their dad. But that kind of talk was rude, and Joseph Vancroft was a wealthy man. If you accused him, you might have to deal with his quiet anger. The whispers stopped, but the watching didn't. If it weren't for what happened next, the talk might have died out completely. Ellis Vancroft, the older sister, had a baby in the spring. There was no husband or suitor that the town knew of. The registry was filled out almost in silence when the baby was brought in for baptism. The pen never touched the page under the line for the father's name. There was nothing in the space. The old rumors didn't seem like gossip anymore. The crossed-out names in the ledger, the girl's scared eyes, and the child with no father all made it clear that this was going to happen. The truth started to take shape, like a huge shadow that fell over the friendly white farmhouse on the edge of town. It wasn't just wrong, it was a horrible thing, a secret kept behind a locked door and a father's watchful eye. The Vancroft farmhouse was different from the others because it was set back from the road on a rise of land that made it hard for people to get to. The house seemed to pull in on itself more and more after the rumors about Ellis's child started. Most of the time, the windows were closed. There was no movement in the porch swing. To the outside world, it was just a quiet family that kept to itself. But inside those walls, people were carefully making the silence. People didn't see the proof. It was in what was written down on paper and kept in the town's dusty ledgers. Joseph Vancroft's account at the feed store showed purchases that were strange for a farmer. He bought tonics and sedatives, which are things that could be used on a chronically ill person, but he also bought quicklime, and in amounts much larger than needed for farming. At about the same time, a neighbor who lived downwind of the Vancroft property remembered a chemical smell that would sometimes come from the farm, strongest near the root cellar. At the time, he didn't think much of it. It was just another weird smell in a country full of them. Weather records from that year show that it was a very cold and harsh winter. The snow came early and stayed late, covering the Ozark hollows in a thick layer of white. Like many others, the Vancrofts stayed on their own land, but their isolation felt different. It felt like it was true. A young farm worker who was hired to help with the spring planting later talked about it. He remembered seeing his younger sister Margaret watch him from a window on the second floor. One afternoon, when he went to get water, he found that the side door was locked. Joseph told him that Margaret was sick and needed to sleep without being disturbed. The farmhand saw the key turn in the lock from the outside. The old-school logs from that same season show that Ellis Vancroft, who was then in her mid-teens, was quiet. There was no reason given. She was on the list one day and not the next. It was a quiet erasure. The most terrifying story may have come from a group of letters found many years later, written by a cousin who had only been there for a short time. She told her mother that the Vancroft house was a quiet place that made her feel uneasy. She said that every night she heard strange music coming from behind her uncle's closed door. It was a sad humming sound that didn't seem to have a clear source. She also wrote about doors in the upstairs hallway that wouldn't open, even when she was sure someone was on the other side. The fear was no longer a whisper. The sedatives, the lime, the locked rooms, and the girls disappearing from public life one by one were all part of a pattern. This family was not sick or grieving. The evidence showed that the lives of the Vancroft sisters were being controlled, silenced, and bent to their father's terrible will in this prison. People in the town whispered about things, but women kept secrets that were even more important. There was a truth written down in private, out of sight, for every suspicion spoken over a fence. The first of these truths came from the diary of Sarah Dilling, who was the town's midwife. She was a calm, private woman who had given birth to half of the county's children. A single folded page was found inside an old medical book decades after she died. The entry, which was written quickly but clearly, told the story of the night she was called to the Vancroft farm. It was a secret birth. Sarah's notes were mostly about Joseph, the father, even though Ellis was the mother. He was in the room, and people said he was too close and too watchful. A grandfather might be worried, but this was different. He worked as a guard. The midwife's most disturbing observation was of the baby itself, a weak, quiet baby. She said it was not right in the eyes, which was a vague but very disturbing way to say that something was wrong that went beyond just being sick. Sarah Dilling never went to the police about this record. She was scared of two things: Joseph's temper, which was a cold, quiet anger that promised consequences, and the church and the town itself. Later, in a quiet talk with a neighbor, she told the truth. She thought Joseph Vancroft had fathered the child himself, but saying something like that out loud was asking for trouble, and so no one could see her diary page. The silence stayed. It would take another generation and the chance discovery of a small wooden box for the second, more damning truth to come out. There was a letter inside that Margaret, the younger sister, had never sent. It was written to a friend who had moved away, a desperate cry into the void. She confirmed the town's worst fear in her looping, childish writing. A few words made everything different. A confession that wasn't hers to make. She wrote, "Papa says we are his wives. Forgive us, God." There it was, the victim's undeniable testimony, a direct confession from inside the closed farmhouse. But there were never any charges. Someone found the letter too late. The whispers had been too quiet. Joseph Vancroft lived on as a respected man of property and faith. His reputation was like a fortress, protected by the fear and silence of the whole community. The predator seemed to be able to get away with his crimes, which were buried with his victims under the thick blanket of rural isolation and the town's determined silence. Silence can last forever, but it doesn't last long after death. It took almost 20 years. It was the year 1917. The world was at war, and the secrets of a small town in the Ozarks seemed even smaller. But inside the Vancroft farmhouse, the rot had only gotten worse over time. Ellis, the older sister, was now a thin, broken woman who was sick and grieving for something she couldn't name. A woman named Clara Fielding, who was a visiting nurse, was sent to take care of her. People knew Clara for being kind and having sharp eyes. She was a woman who paid attention. Ellis finally spoke in the dim light of the sick room. The confession came out in a feverish whisper, the words she had kept to herself for 20 years. "He claimed us both," she told the nurse. "The kids were his." The plural hit Clara hard. Kids? More than one. Clara was very organized. She started to ask quiet questions around town, picking up on old rumors. For hours, she bent over old census logs and burial records at the county records office. The pattern that showed up was terrifying. She found records of at least 2 unexplained deaths of babies on the Vancroft farm over the years. These babies' lives were so short that they were never properly counted or fully acknowledged. There were small, unmarked stones in the family plot in the town cemetery. These were crude headstones that had been weathered by the years and only said the word baby. There was no last name or date, as if these kids had never really been there. Clara Fielding did something that Sarah Dilling, the midwife, had been too scared to do. She said something. She didn't go to the police. She knew that a sick woman's word against a powerful man would not win. Instead, she went to the local Veterans Hall, where people weighed and measured a man's reputation every day. She talked to a man whose opinion mattered who had known Joseph Vancroft for 40 years. The story spread like wildfire in dry grass. The old whispers, which had been quiet for a long time, turned into a loud roar of anger. Families who had long thought something was wrong at the Vancroft place finally felt brave enough to say its name. The community's suspicion, which was once a private shame, turned into public anger. The law finally had to pay attention. But when justice moves so slowly, it often gets cheated. The Vancroft farm sent word before the sheriff could even get a warrant. A sudden stroke had taken Joseph. He died in his own bed, and the law didn't touch him. For a short time, it looked like he had won. He had escaped judgment on earth. He would take his secrets with him to the grave, but once the truth is out, it has its own life. Joseph Vancroft was dead, but the story was still going strong. The whispers had turned into statements, and the truth would not die with him. Joseph Vancroft was dead. But his story wasn't over. The law didn't put him in a cell. So the community decided to put him in a different kind of prison. The prison of memory. One last piece of evidence was found after he died, and while his few remaining belongings were being taken out of the farmhouse, it was a small wooden box with a stack of Ellis's drawings inside. These were sketches she had made over the years on scraps of paper and the backs of old receipts. The pictures were so clear that they said more than any confession ever could. There were pictures of doors with heavy bolts on the outside, pictures of a tall, shadowy man with no face standing in every room, and the saddest of all, pictures of a cradle always seen from a distance, with no mother next to it, as if the artist herself was not allowed to get close. These simple, haunting pictures were the last silent proof of a life spent in prison. They were passed from one person to another, sealing the town's fate. The church, where the silence began, was the first place to make an official decision about this new accounting. The elders met and, with a sense of finality, opened the ledger from 1,898 again. A new entry was made for their father next to the names of Ellis and Margaret, which had been crossed out. The clerk wrote the official correction next to Joseph Vancroft's name. Stricken for abomination. The man who had used his position in the church to protect himself was now thrown out, and his sin would be known forever. He was not done being punished yet. In that town, a man's name was his legacy. Joseph's turned into a curse. People talked about him with shame and disgust. He sold his land, which used to be a sign of his power, for a small fraction of its value, as if the soil itself was bad. The community made a choice when it was time to mark his grave. They did not put a marker on his grave. There was no stone, no name, just a piece of land that would be forgotten over time. He was gone. The courts of men never touched him, but the justice of memory was always there and never changed. People used to talk behind his back about his daughters and call them sinners. Now, though, they were remembered for what they were, victims who had been through the worst. And for many years after that, people still remembered his name. It was kept alive as a warning, a story told on cold nights to remind everyone that the truth will always come out, even when the law is slow and justice seems lost. The Ozark Hills had kept his secret for a long time, but the land still remembers.